is a great pleasure. I speak from the depth of my heart to bring genuine thinkers to share with us products of their writings, products of their thoughts, and products of their moral activities. Professor David Gullett is not new to African Ascent. To be precise, this is his second time. The first time he appeared, my guests fondly remember how stellar and spectacular his performances were, rich with humor, with anecdotes, and with a masterful understanding of Nicaraguan history. I'm sure members of my audience remember how rejuvenated, enlightened, and transformed they were by that first performance. So impressed I am by him both as a colleague, a friend, and a committed editor of two of my books, and also editor of numerous articles that I try to contribute to New Political Science when he was an editor of that wonderful journal. Tonight he wears a different hat. He had written an extremely important work that is a novel that calls itself a novel called Dreaming Nicaragua. How titillating the title is. So for the next hour then, enjoy his writings, his analysis, and his conversations with me as we delve deep into the internal architectonics of Dreaming Nicaragua. Professor David Gullett, among many other things, is a writer, a teacher who served as chair of the English department, I believe, at Simmons College for many, many, many years, during which time many remember him as an exceptional chair of that department. He's also now deeply engaged with his significant other, Professor Margaret Gullett, who was also a guest of African Ascent. I intend to invite her again. The two of them have this enviable commitment to the people of Nicaragua. They go there very often, and they are engaged in a project with a long title that I'm very afraid to say extemporaneously without temptations of distorting it, making mistakes. I believe the name of the project is the Newton Sur
San Juan del Sur.
San Juan del Sur City Project. So David Gullett then comes to us tonight to talk to us about Dreaming Nicaragua. Welcome to African Ascent.
Thank you so much, Teodros. Delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, we can begin just about anywhere. You have so much to offer. You've done so much. You are a writer, a teacher, an actor, a performer, an activist. There are so many layers to your works from which I could begin. But tonight, African Ascent wants to commit itself to Dreaming Nicaragua. So I guess the first question that I would like us to examine is for you to introduce us to these complex and fantastic characters that surround the literary landscape of Dreaming Nicaragua. So why don't we begin there?
Well, all right. Thanks for the invitation. The central character in the 20th century is a man named Jesse Pelletier, who is an English professor at UMass Boston. He is, or he has been. He's also a veteran of the Vietnam War, deeply scarred by that long and dreadful war in the 1960s. In the year 2000, he has divorced his wife. He's left UMass Boston. He's gone with a number of other veterans to Nicaragua in the late 80s, early 90s, on something called the Veterans Peace Convoy, which was trying to defy Ronald Reagan's war against Nicaragua. And in the course of this visit to Nicaragua, he falls in love with the place. And he ends up buying a small hotel in the coastal town on the Pacific coast of Nicaragua called San Juan del Sur. And the terrible troubles that have plagued his living, his waking and his sleeping life back in Boston begin to disappear. He has a calmer life. He has less tragedy. He works with poorer people. The fishing is good. He's a fisherman at heart. He has friends locally. The only thing that's missing in his life is his relationship with his daughter named Susie, from whom he has become estranged during the course of the divorce. He hasn't seen her for years. She's now in graduate school up in California. And as the book begins, she has come to visit her father. She wants to see if she can patch it up with the old man and have a relationship such as they had when she was a little girl. He too very much looks forward to reconnecting with his daughter. So these are the two characters that we meet at the beginning of the story: Jesse, in the year 2000, and his daughter, Susie. But to backtrack a bit, one of the things that Jesse does when he lives alone in this small hotel, he's got his office with an old air conditioner, he's become a Nicaraguan history buff. He fills his computer with digital archives about Nicaraguan history, including visual representations of the country in the mid-19th century in American news magazines. The first illustrated news magazines came into the United States in the 1850s. Harper's Illustrated, and also something called Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly. Artists would be sent around the world to trouble spots. They would do very fine drawings. The drawings would be put on the next boat back to New York. When they hit New York, lithographers would turn them into lithographs or copper plates, and then they would be printed along with the stories of what was happening. This is the beginning of illustrated journalism. Up to this point, journalism was only words. But starting in the 1850s, you begin to get pictures and words together. It's like the beginning of what we take for granted today, Time magazine. That began back in the 1850s. So Jesse, in the year 2000, has deeply immersed himself in the life of Nicaragua and its relationships with the United States back in the 1850s. So he's obsessed with this period, which is a fascinating decade, by the way. In the United States, the decade before the Civil War, the 1850s, is an extremely interesting time. It's the period of what we call the period of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was a phrase used in that period by American politicians. To give a shorthand version of what it meant was, heaven has destined the United States to become the master of all this ill-organized, poorly administered land owned by Indians and Mexicans and Spanish-speaking people to the south. It's clear that Providence has destined us manifestly to make ourselves master of this. It's a kind of a story people tell themselves when they want to become instant imperialists. We know what happened to the lands of the Indians, the Native Americans. We also know that in the late 1840s, the United States simply moved the border between the United States and Mexico. It was an imperialist war sent into Mexico. The Mexicans lost, and the United States gained hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of square miles of previously Mexican territory. That instinct that white Anglo-Saxon Americans have an inherent God-given right to move into other people's countries, to take them over, and to reshape them in some sort of Anglo-Saxon image of what should be better for these countries, is very much alive in this period. One of the things that happened in the 1850s in Nicaragua, and Jesse is very much aware of this story, a soldier of fortune by the name of William Walker, a highly educated man from Tennessee, put together a ragtag band of soldiers of fortune, of mercenaries, and he hired himself and his soldiers out to one of the two sides of the eternal left versus right civil war that was always been going on in Nicaragua since the 1820s when they got their independence. As chance would have it, the leader of the liberal faction and the leader of the conservative faction promptly died, both of them. And in the power vacuum, this a man from Tennessee, William Walker, had himself elected president of Nicaragua. And he was president of Nicaragua for about 3 years until, in fact, he was driven out by a combined army of Central Americans. Jesse is very much aware of this, so much so that he imagines what it would have been like if, instead of himself being a veteran of the Vietnam War, trying to put his life together after a dreadful American invasion of another country, suppose he had been the veteran of the American war against Mexico. Mm-hmm. Suppose he had found himself, after that war, in the early 1850s, beginning to work for the richest man in the world, whose name was Cornelius Vanderbilt. He had made his fortunes in New York in canals and railroads and shipping. He had an immense fleet of steamboats. And as soon as gold was discovered in California in 1849, Vanderbilt saw an opportunity to make a killing by opening a steamship line which would take people from New York City, down the Caribbean, up the river that connects Nicaragua with its big lake, and then across a small 10 miles of land to San Juan del Sur, where Vanderbilt steamboats would be ready to whisk them off to the Golden Gate, to California. This is a true story. This really happened. I didn't make this up. But in the midst of this thing that really happened, Jesse imagines an alternative life for himself at an earlier period. Suppose, because I think all of us do this at some point in our lives, suppose I'd been born in a different place at a different time. Mm-hmm. What would my life have been? Mm-hmm. In this case, he imagines himself working for Vanderbilt for a while, marrying a local girl in San Juan del Sur, opening a hotel, as in fact he's doing in the year 2000. So he has, in a way, in his mind and also in his computer, because he begins to write these sketches, imagining himself 150 years before. What would I have been like? What sort of life would I have had if I had been an American in Nicaragua in the 1850s? So I know that sometimes when you read this book, you were a little baffled by the sudden shifts of focus. Sometimes in the year 2000, sometimes in the year 1852 or 1853. What's going on? So the character has the same name. It's Jesse here and Jesse there. How do you make sense of it? The simple answer, I don't want to be too simple because the book is complex, is that he's living one life and writing another life.
I see.
So that's the basic background. It's a multi-leveled story. There is a year 2000 Jesse and his daughter. Then there's the 1850s, where he doesn't have a daughter yet. He does have a wife. He has a business to run. And he's also deeply involved in this turmoil in Nicaragua in the 1850s caused by an American invasion. There are other characters in the book. He has friends, Nicaraguan friends. His fishing buddy, his Professor Rodolfo, who's a school teacher with whom he fishes. He has other innkeepers, and bartenders, and restaurant owners who are his friends and neighbors. There are also, early on in the book, out of nowhere comes an old Vietnam buddy of his, a man named Tapper. Vulgar, profane, foul-mouthed, grasping. I think he's an interesting character myself, and gave me great pleasure writing his part, who hangs out with someone who's clearly probably an ex or current CIA agent. And they are into God knows what. It's never quite sure what happens. He also has friends among Americans who come down to work in Nicaragua, like Margaret and myself. And there's a couple there that sort of roughly shadows who we are. Mm-hmm. So there are many, many characters in the book, both 20th century and mid-19th century. I should say 21st century, since the century begins in the year 2000. And it was a great pleasure for me to do this back and forth between the different periods of the book. Because in a way, in Jesse's mind, we do relive the past. History does repeat itself sometimes. Mm-hmm. And of course, there is an older idea that comes from the Far East, from India, that in fact our lives do repeat and cycle back. Mm-hmm. I'm a great James Joyce scholar.
Of course. And
as we know, James Joyce's great, most famous novel, Ulysses, imagines a man in Dublin in the year 1906 who reenacts the various episodes of Homer's Odyssey. All the episodes in the Odyssey are reenacted in modern Dublin. It's a kind of joke of Joyce's, and yet I think in a deep sense Joyce does feel that human experience is finally a series of repetitions. There are some basic stories that we tell ourselves. There are some basic plots that we reenact. And in many ways, there is no new thing under the sun. That we repeat the errors and the triumphs of our ancestors. We can read history, but just because we read history doesn't mean we learn the lessons of history. And in many ways, we think that each of us is living a new life from scratch. But in fact, there are certain patterns in our lives, which if we read history, or if we read fiction, or if we read any other older literature, we realize many of the things that are happening to us have happened to others in the past. That's an assumption underlying the novel.
And of course, I'm intrigued by two other characters, Camille and Susie.
Ah, yes. Susie is a young woman in her 20s. She's a free spirit. She's a woman of her own. She knows how to handle her own life. She's been through the divorce between her father and her mother. She is a graduate student in California. She's waiting to go to a graduate program in the fall. She's visiting her father. And into this circuit comes a young man, a young Nicaraguan man, whose name is Camilo Sanchez. Camilo is an ecological activist. This part of Nicaragua is biologically very rich. Many of the gigantic sea turtles, the sea tortoises that roam the Pacific, come ashore there and lay their eggs. There's certain highly protected beaches, one of them protected by the Nicaraguan army with their AK-47s to keep people from stealing the eggs. It's, by the way, it is an unfortunate belief among Nicaraguans that turtle eggs are aphrodisiacs. And so there's a restaurant up on the Pan American Highway that says, "Hay sopa de Viagra," which means we have Viagra soup, which means we have a soup that we serve with turtle eggs floating in it. It's completely illegal now. And the Nicaraguan government has cracked down on this. At any rate, Camilo there's some talk of putting in a container port in one of these precious beaches, And he has been leading a movement of Nicaraguan and international ecological activists to stop this container port from being put in their coast. Early in the novel, this handsome, fiery young man with whom Susie has already fallen in love, and they have become lovers, suddenly disappears. No one has any idea what could have happened to him. Many people have theories. Susie is not the first woman in his life. He's had many women. One theory is that perhaps a jealous girlfriend or a jealous wife has done away with him or had him disappeared. Others feel that perhaps the business community, who sees economic opportunity if a major international development takes place on our shores, wants this gadfly out of the way, and that they've arranged to have him disappeared or done away with. Plenty of theories, no facts.
No facts.
And I won't tell you, because our readers have to read the book, what the answer to the question, what happened to Camilo Sanchez? I won't tell you what the answer to that question is. So these are the two other characters, younger people. Jesse himself has no romantic interest during about the first third or first half of the book, until a woman in her sailboat sails into the harbor and begins to complicate his life. And I could talk a little bit about her too, if you'd like.
Please do.
Her name is Caitlin. She's from California. Some years ago, she had been given by her doctor what amounts to a death sentence. You have terminal cancer. You have a kind of terminal cancer, and you probably have a year or so to live. So she says to herself, well, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die doing the thing I love to do most, which is sailing. She has a sailboat. She has a friend who's a gay designer who's also himself dying. He's dying of AIDS. And so the two of them together decide that it would be a lovely thing if they could sail south, away from San Francisco, away from the United States, to their final resting place, to their destiny. If they have to die at sea, let them die at sea. Actually, the friend does in fact slip himself overboard as he gets sicker and sicker. She ends up in San Juan del Sur in Nicaragua, and probably runs into Camilo Sanchez's aunt, who is an herbal curandera, which is to say, she's an expert in folk cures and folk medicines. And so Caitlin anchors her boat, goes into the backwoods with this woman, and the next thing you know, her cancer is in remission. And she feels better and better. She's cleansed her mind, she's cleansed her body. And so when we meet her, she's not sick and she's not dying. She does not have a love life because, of course, she was at death's door. But she and Jesse meet, they strike it off, and a midlife love affair takes place in the shadow of the young person's love affair that we've already visited. Because, of course, you know, for people in their 40s or 50s to fall in love, it's a different sort of dynamic than people in their 20s falling in love.
I see.
So those are the main characters of the book. Unless you're
I
thinking of
think you've
someone
done
else.
remarkable work. I don't even want to stop you talking about the characters, but we have to move on.
Okay.
And now, as I was reading the novel, I couldn't make up my mind with respect to the kind of novel that I'm reading. I kept on asking myself, am I reading a historical novel? Am I reading a political novel? Am I reading a novel on romance? Or am I reading a novel that combines all three? In which case then it becomes very challenging to separate the history from the politics, and from the politics from the romantic storyline. So it took quite a number of hours for me to read the novel, which I did from the beginning to the end, but with tremendous effort. I must admit that I had to put it down and then go back to it, put it down and then go back to it. But then finally I developed a method that glued me to the novel.
Do tell.
The fluidity of the language. There are passages that I'm going to read towards the end that are just so beautiful that I would be invited by them to return to the novel and to read on. And some of these passages were so good that I would read them over and over again in order to learn from them, because I happen to be a writer like you. So I wanted to write from someone who is very skilled, as you are, who is a very rich and complex style. So what is your advice to readers so that they can stay on reading?
Well, I actually have written up a reader's guide, and Teodros, I'm going to present you with a copy of this on air so all our friends can see it. This is just some ideas about how to read the book. As for its complexity, I've written 2 other novels, unpublished, and they were typical novels, which is to say it had a beginning, a middle, and end. You sit down and read the book, you fly right through it, and it has all the joy of everything is in order, it's all the same time frame. A follows B, B follows C. You move right through the chronology. I'm at a point in my life when I wanted to write a more complex, more textured, a more difficult novel. Difficult in the sense that a great carpet, let us say, from Iran is difficult, in which the different fabrics and the different designs blend in among each other. So the warp and the woof, threads appear, threads disappear. Ideas appear, ideas disappear, but they pop up later. I adore what we used to call Persian carpets, Iranian carpets. And they are, of course, women's work, and many women get together and do them. The design, Henry James has a wonderful idea in which he says, when you're looking at one of these great carpets, when you're looking up close, you're looking at the beautiful, beautiful work of the different threads coming together. And you're amazed at the brilliance of the individual designs, bit by bit, piece by piece. But he says, but then when you stand back, all the different parts of the carpet begin to make sense among themselves. It's what he calls the figure in the carpet, the larger shape, the larger designs of the carpet. So you have both the fine, careful detail, line by line, page by page, but also the larger design. And of course, my design is a design in which two different time periods, the 1850s and the first year or so of the 21st century, year 2000, play off against each other, in which history and politics are a part of the romance of human life. You and I are both political people, and we know that, that politics can be very sexy, it can be very attractive, it can be all-consuming. But history itself, and I am a history buff, I care about history. I care about the lives of the people who went before us, because their experiences in many ways shaped the kind of life that we live, the world we live in. So I did want to write a complex, difficult novel, and I did not want it to be an easy book to read, but I wanted to find a reader like Teodros Kiros, who will say, this book gave me a lot of trouble. I put it down and picked it up again. Bit by bit, I was enchanted by the language. Bit by bit, I began to see how the parts fit together. But I wanted also a reader who would sort of say, this is not like any book I've ever read. This is a book of a different sort. I could write novels like anyone else, and I've written a couple, but I wanted to leave that behind me. I really wanted to leave this as a, I don't think I'll write another novel. It took me 10 years to write this book. And it does have structure and texture and complexity which are conscious. I did it on purpose. That's what I wanted.
I see. Well, if you concur now, we have talked enough around the novel. I would like the novel to speak for itself.
Let's do that.
So why don't we have the novel speak for itself by you choosing your very favorites, and I'll also do the same. Between the two of us, we will do justice to the novel, I hope.
I found a piece this afternoon, which I think is a good place to start. I have to correct myself. The book does not, the older time frame of the book is not just the 1850s. Because in fact, Jesse has a very exciting period in the 1850s. She marries a local girl and has a child or two, but then realizes that his wife is in fact probably attracted to women more than she is to men. Mm-hmm. And one central part of the book is she falls in love with an American woman passing through, and the American woman falls in love with her. And this, of course, makes Jesse feel immensely left out. He never does have a deeply rich, complex, loving relationship with a woman in his life. This is the Jesse of the 1850s. In many ways, he's a very sad character. That he's been through this terrible war, the Mexican War, and he marries a beautiful girl, but the beautiful girl, in fact, is not the girl of his dreams. And so there's a place in the book in which he, in the year 1870, we're now 20 years after the May, this is on page 49, Jesse Pelletier in the 21st century imagines the Jesse Pelletier in the 1870s sitting down to write in an old ledger book, to write a journal.
Okay.
It's really a confessional piece. He's trying to be as honest as he can about his own life. So let me read just a bit of this.
Please, as much as you want.
I lean out over the slow-moving stream and peer down into the flow of all time. Not everything is lost. Traces remain. The outlines of what once slid past take shape. Shimmery features, coming into focus on the troubled surface. The watery mirror, a man with my face. There, Don Jesse Pelletier, a man at midlife, seated at his heavy desk of tropical hardwood, pre-digital pen in his hand, working steadily, word after word, in a black, leather-bound notebook, wrapped in rawhide thongs, fringe faded, bug-riddled, unlined pages, writing in a pinched and scrawling hand as though to defy easy reading. He does not lift his eyes to see perfect waves curl and fall into themselves. His brow is furrowed. A black river flows out in the wake of his quill tip. This is what the man, Jesse Pelletier, in 1870 is writing. San Juan del Sur, January 29th, 1870. Be so kind, sir, as to find and write the truth. Did I know that first time I came ashore in Greytown before San Juan del Sur, before Xiomara, that's his wife, that I had found my heart's true home in this impossible country? No, most assuredly not there, not then. Well, in that case, when was it? San Carlos? Mud and excrement and rotting palm frond roofs and beached bungos? A most emphatic negative. Well then, when the leaky hulk of the fittingly named Ometepe, that's the steamboat that crosses the lake, belching black smoke, yawed and bellied past the noble twin peaks of Ometepe, the wind at our backs, waves over the stern. Stop. Remember, perhaps. It was toward dusk. We had been delayed setting out from San Carlos. Something about a prize breeding cock, his willow cage being brought aboard. And where should it go? And the fierce bird, savage, slicing fingers that tried to lift withies off the gunnels. The captain himself trying to help and getting a nasty gash in his palm, then going ashore to get the wound dressed, cursing all the while that he would spit that cock for his supper, and the cock ear-splittingly defiant. So it was not until dusk, or going toward dusk, all afternoon the giant pair of cones, this is the twin peaks of these mountains, these volcanoes in the middle of the lake, the twin cones had grown taller and clearer as we neared. What had been a hazy blue silhouette became green folds of an old volcano, at least the closer one, Madeira it was. The other, Concepcion, was mostly sheer thrust of sterile ash and lava. So the folds grew greener the closer we got. And once we were abreast, and the sun came over the coast range from the direction of San Juan del Sur and struck the island mountain, all that vivid green touched with gold, then a brazen gold, then deep bronze, then the sort of color you'd see if you looked at a branch of laurel through a glass of whiskey. Why did it seem to me so stirring, so near sublime? Was it from growing up in a flat country with no hills, much less mountains? I could see almost no houses, a few along the shore perhaps. But wait, there, higher up, a dab of whitewash on a little shoulder in the upsweep of green. And I thought, I could go there. I could make my way over by boat and rent a horse and perhaps hire a guide. And we would take water and not bread, corn pone or some such, big straw hats, knee-high boots against snakes, and set out and reach the house at midday. And I would dismount and rap on the porch pillar, and after a pause, a woman would come out. The very woman I have always dreamt of. And she would be dark-haired and innocent of elegance and suspicious and unsmiling. And I would doff my ridiculous hat and say in my plodding Spanish, I was on the lake. I was passing by on the steamboat for Virgin Bay. I looked up the mountain. I saw your house. From out on the lake it appeared to be only a scrap of white floating on a green sea. No, a great wave of green. And I said to myself, I must visit the person who lives in that house, because I was sure that the person who lived in such a house must be my friend. Then, I thought, then she would turn, her dark eyes widening, and open her mouth to speak. But at that moment, the Ometepe pitched and plunged into a trough and heaved me out of my reverie. Sunset lands, pillars of Hercules. Not that I'd imagined any such moment or any such place back in New York. Not when Commodore Vanderbilt had asked me to come along on a little reconnaissance mission down Central America. I was looking for money, an adventure, nothing more. I reckon I assumed Central America would be similar to the northern Mexico of my boyhood. Martial adventure of a few years before. Monterrey, Buena Vista, Contreras, Churubusco, dry, mostly treeless mountains, scrub and cactus. Thus, my surprise at finding Nicaragua green and moist. Thus, my surprise at feeling there on the lake in the late afternoon that I had, in some strange fashion, arrived at last. I can pause there.
Okay.
Because he does love the country. And he imagines that his imaginary avatar, his previous self in the 1850s, would have fallen in love with the country. Growing up on the coast of North Carolina, very flat coastal land. And then going to Mexico and saying, oh, well, this is Latin America. Well, Mexico is mountainous, but it's scrappy and dry and full of scrub growth. And suddenly to end up in this country which is rich and green and like paradise, like everyone's dream of paradise. Tropical, lush. And he imagines, of course, just imagines his dreams, this woman who will be there at this house that he spies up on the side of the volcano.
Okay.
I can follow, I think, with a little companion piece. It's not terribly long.
Please. We have time. Yeah.
This is on page 64. This has to do with the relationship between Northerners and Southerners.
Okay.
You know that many Europeans, Northern Europeans, yearn for Africa. They yearn for the tropics. Mm-hmm. They yearn for the South. Mm-hmm. And many people from the South, from Africa, from Latin America, mm-hmm. yearn to go north. Mm-hmm. They need a cooler, more astringent, more challenging landscape to live in. And so in many ways, the northern mind dreams of the South, and the southern mind dreams of the North.
Okay.
So this is a journal entry of Jesse's, 2nd of June.
Page.
This is page 64.
Okay.
One impulse draws the northern mind south. Another draws the southern mind north. Goethe and Byron yearn for Italy. Dinesen, that's Isaac Dinesen, for Africa. Elizabeth Bishop for Rio. Tennyson aches to see, quote, before I die, the palms and temples of the South. Mr. Henry Adams of Boston gravitates with family feeling to the miasmal swamp of Washington, D.C., and in the chilly first months of 1893, and then again in 1894, this professional wanderer, Mr. Henry Adams of Boston, Massachusetts, finds himself in, of all places, Cuba, with his chum Clarence King. His wife's suicide shadows his late midlife, but does not dull his wit. He finds Havana, quote, a vile hole, but still tramps about the countryside, geologizing under a sun that melted me like a jellyfish. And he smokes the most delightful cigars after seeing them made in a manner that would disgust a pig. But it is when he climbs the hills above Santiago de Cuba, and by the way, this is just above Guantanamo Bay, known to all our viewers. This is 1890s. Henry Adams, the great historian, is actually spending one of his winter months in the hills above Guantanamo Bay. It's when he climbs the hills above Santiago de Cuba that he is surprised by a sudden sympathy between his soul and these tropical heights. Quote, by Santiago, it was beautiful. These high haciendas are cafetales or coffee plantations, and I am clear that these are my long-lost home. The climate is divine. No words can exaggerate its perfection in winter. The landscape is fascinating. There are no venomous snakes. I have not yet seen a scorpion, or a centipede, or tarantula, or newspaper, or anything vicious. And the redneck Tar Heel poetaster, Professor J. Pelletier, he flees the primal bad scene of Beaufort, North Carolina, for the suffocating liberation of Chapel Hill, which is where the University of North Carolina is. He hits the ground running from Chapel Hill to the napalmed palms and booby-trapped temples of Vietnam. Soul scorched but still wriggling, he touches base briefly in Chapel Hill, then off to Boston, hot on the trail of love. Boston, where those deadly, chilly northern skies half the year drive you inward to the blessed confinement of your study. A town in which you can actually assume people you meet read books, where traditions of stubborn nonconformity refresh the political well springs. In the 80s, marching with some other Vietnam vets to demand an end to Contra aid, this is the aid to the Contras in Nicaragua, Jesse had called out to the guano-whitened statue of the old arch-enemy of slavery across from the Arlington Street Church, "William Ellery Channing, come down and join us." But Boston, why weren't you enough? And why did our man Jesse burn his Tobin Bridges? And how did that tropical soul of his erupt from a pile of frozen dog turds at curbside, erupt and head south? And when did it hit him that his long-lost home had, in some sense, always been and was at that moment and would always be southwesternmost Nicaragua? Maybe that moment at dusk, that first year, out in Miravalle, playing stickball with the village kids in the schoolyard after a day of digging foundation trenches for the new school, when he stopped everything, breathing included, as the oropendola, it's a beautiful bird, the oropendola swooped by in the golden light? Or perhaps his first time body surfing at Playa Ramanso, coming in on a long-reaching perfect wave, slaloming from side to side, but keeping his eyes fixed on the moon floating up through the branches of that pink flowering tree at the edge of the beach? "Excuse me, sir, your reality check." Say, what? It was not some mythical northern or southern mind that brought you to these pacifying shores. No, it was a mix of banal realities. Your failing marriage, your haunted mind, your dead-end professional life, the sheer accident of those Vietnam veterans wanting to do their convoy, and you able to take the summer off and wanting to tag along, and yes, agreed, your hatred of the New England winter, and so, yes, some sense that heading south always feels right. As for Henry Adams, like many Yankees, he was looking for a winter house somewhere warm, where he could spend a few months before heading back to the real world. New York, Boston, Washington. He couldn't have lived there in Cuba. Kindly don't confuse seasonal real estate with pilgrimage. Actually, Dinesen and Bishop, this is Isaac Dinesen, the novelist, and Elizabeth Bishop, the poet, are better cases. Drawn south by chance, they fall in love with the place and fall in love in the place and stay. Which leaves me exactly where in the great expatriate scheme of things? Where indeed?
All right. I'll read from page 66.
Uh-huh.
Okay. I have so many choices.
So many choices, yes.
That's why. Maybe I'll read from page 68. And I will not contextualize this.
All right.
I want the writing to speak for itself. Right, says Boston 1. You weren't there. How could you be so sure? Exactly, says Jesse, downing the rest of the beer and turning to the young American. You weren't here. But even if you were here, how could you be sure of anything? Susie roars up to the curb and slams on the brakes. The Jeep slides a few feet on scraps of palm frond. She hits the horn. Boston too is jolted awake. Jesse rises, waves. Who is that, says the girl. Her eyes on Susie. The love of my life, the love of my life. I'm out there. If you need a place to stay tonight, I ran around the corner, next to the pool hall. El Gringo, Pionelero, cleanest sheets in town. He drops 50 chords on the table, then shakes all their hands, lingering a bit longer to squeeze the purple-nailed hand of the girl and make quick eye contact. For the first time beneath all the paraphernalia, she has the look of a woman. As they pull away, Susie asks, who are they? Pilgrims, says Jesse. Green pilgrims. Ah. They head up the street past the separated piles of gingerbread Gothic from the dismantled casona. You're late, says Jesse. I was beginning to get a little freaked out. I thought we agreed. I thought you said you'd be back before dark. Yeah, well, guess I miscalculated. That Ostional road is real twisty-turny, and it gets dark around here like whom?
Like wham.
Like wham, my glasses. So you were in Ostiona. We were at some beach, but I had to drop Camilo back to his house. And then I had to say hello to the folks and all. Hey, look, I'm back safe and sound, okay? This is not Cape Cod. A woman alone gets stuck out there after sunset. Jessie, she says with an age in her voice, give it a rest. Of course, that's not the first time she's ever called him by his first name instead of Daddy. But tonight it has changed with what sounds to him like a backlog of impatience. He doesn't reply. They make their way up the back stairs of the Gringo, Pinorello, to the private second floor with Susie's room, the open-air roof garden, and the semi-enclosed cooking area. Susie heads right to the shower. Jessie lights the propane and starts heating up the remains of her last night's huge, delicious veggie stir-fry with rice. She comes out in a white cotton beach dress, rubbing her head with a towel. She opens the fridge, takes out the blender of pineapple banana, and pours herself a glass. Look, she says, leaning against a pillar that supports the overhang. I know you must want to worry about me for some reason, but you've got to understand, I'm a big girl now. And I don't do stupid things. My driving's safe. So is my sex life. So is my emotional life. I keep a sharp eye out for danger. I have a pretty good sense of how the world works. And so I tend not to get hurt. So there is no need for you to get all anxious when I'm not around. We have about 3 minutes left, and I would like to defer to you to do the last reading for us.
I've got a nice 3-minute piece. This is on page 116.
If you would spare 1 minute for me, there is this beautiful sketch that I wanted to read. But
Okay,
go ahead. No, go ahead. You go ahead first.
In the last year, not one, as Jesse had told Susie, but 4, maybe 5 different drunks have been found murdered on the beach, down by the estero or river mouth, their throats cut. The police are clueless. Of course, no ordinary, self-respecting San Juanino would be caught dead wandering around the beach at night, especially that seedy end of the beach, down there near the raunchier bars and the informal brothel. The buzz around town is that we have a homicidal maniac, un psicopata, psychopath, haunting the darker fringes of our otherwise idyllic existence. But since none of those receiving the buzz and then passing it on in hushed tones to his or her neighbor is a beach-dwelling drunk, the very word psicopata rolls off the tongue with a delicious, slightly illicit thrill. The beach at San Juan is dreamy and paradisal during the day, with its long arc of orderly surf and the headlands at the north and south looming like bookends. But when the sun drops into the sea at 5:30, as it does all year round, nightfall comes quick, and the darkness brings a sudden creepiness. Men come drifting out of the shadows of the palms. Where have they been all day? And those few San Juaneños and tourists left on the beach hurry home.
This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for African Ascent, with David Gillette, who's been reading to us from Dreaming Nicaragua, a novel that I suggest each and every one of you make an effort to purchase for yourselves from appropriate bookstores and also on Amazon.com.